Yes, everybody knows Rheal, so I didn't actually prepare something for Rheal because I've introduced Rheal a few times in the past about his background, where he comes from. Does anybody in this crowd here does not know who Rheal is? Well, there you have it, Rheal.
Infamous.
Yeah, there you are. So Rheal, you're on board.
Rheal. So Rheal's come here to talk to us today about basically wintering losses and how bad was it. Being the provincial apiarist, he gets the data dump of people who will report their losses or report the trouble. He also is crucial in monitoring disease trends as well. Thank you very much for joining us today, Rheal, and the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll share my screen.
There we go.
Okay, so you see my screen?
Yes, sir. Yes, we
Okay,
do.
good. Sometimes because I usually use two monitors, and sometimes it goes on a different monitors. When I'm down to one monitor, I'm never quite sure what is actually being projected. So, yes, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the winter losses. And the reason why I'm giving this presentation is that I gave this presentation to the special general meeting of the Manitoba beekeepers a couple of weeks ago. And part of it was that there was a lot of talk about what the winter losses were. And we normally run an annual winter loss survey. And it's actually a survey that's coordinated across the country. So every province runs virtually the same questions. We can add additional questions to our survey, but we have a core group of questions that every province asks. And we typically coordinate that in the month of May. So in addition to hearing all of these reports on high losses and really not knowing, whether they were accurate or not, when this special general meeting was called and we were going to be talking specifically about losses, the MBA asked me if I could conduct a preliminary survey. So this is what I'm going to be presenting tonight, is the preliminary survey. And just before I get into that, I will say that the preliminary survey was conducted, in a very, very short time period. And it was really focused for this MBA meeting. So it was emailed out only to commercial beekeepers with 50 colonies or more. So you need to know that going into this data, but I will be doing another survey, the regular annual, winter loss survey, and that will include non-commercial beekeepers. Let's get a pointer. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you about this preliminary loss survey. It was done in kind of the middle of April, so we consider this more of a snapshot survey, and it really was to get data right now so we could have these discussions, but realizing that the annual winter loss survey is still going to be where we're really going to look at the entire province, but we're also going to be asking a lot more questions in that annual loss survey regarding management in preparation for winter. We're also in that survey include kind of the spring dwindling of non-viable hives. So those culls that never recover from winter. So they're still essentially part of the winter loss because they never were able to recover. And we're going to be, again, conducting that survey in mid-May because we normally ask those questions after the spring dwindle period is over. And in the prairie provinces, we know by the 21st of May, usually we're done spring dwindle and we're moving towards the honey production season by that time. And as I mentioned before, this annual loss survey will include non-commercial beekeepers. It will only be emailed out to non-commercial beekeepers, but all commercial beekeepers will either get an email copy or they'll get a mailed out version. So we still want to really represent the entire province, but we're focusing on commercial beekeeping as well. So just that's where the colonies are. So in saying that, knowing that we did the survey before spring dwindle, we did it kind of mid-April, we knew that this was going to be a very conservative estimate, and it was going to be essentially an early estimate of winter losses. So the expectation is that whatever number I came up with is probably going to be on the low end of our winter losses, and we're likely going to have substantially more losses than that. You know, sometimes spring dwindle is 10%, sometimes it could be as much as 20%. So we know that whatever number we got here, likely we can almost add 10% to get what we're going to be as an average loss, but it could be much higher than that. And more importantly, this preliminary survey really was only able to sample people that had access to their bees. When I sent out the preliminary survey, a lot of beekeepers got back to me right away saying, I have no idea. My bees are under snow. So we knew that it would be underrepresented, but we hoped that we would be able to get good data. So when I say generate an accurate estimate, it was still a hopeful thing, but I wanted to see if we could get good colony representation in the data set to have some confidence that when we say that losses are 40 to 50%, we had some data to back us up rather than just rumor mill. So based on that preamble, this is the data that I got out of that questionnaire. And going back, that questionnaire was very simple, kind of how many bees did you put into winter? How many came out alive? And give me your top 3 reasons of why you thought what caused the mortality in your hives. So it was a very, very, very simple survey. So when we look at the actual data that came in, and it got emailed out, so I think I have 160 email addresses that I was able to email it out. I did get a response of 55 beekeepers, and I consider that not too bad. But probably even better than that is that in those 55 responses, I got representation of 54,000 colonies out of the 14,000 that we have in the province. So that's under 50%, but it's fairly close to 50%. And in a survey, if you get over 30%, you could consider that the data is starting to become more robust. It's able to kind of go show your highs and lows, and it's probably going to be getting closer to giving you an accurate average. So with a little less than 55,000 colonies, I was feeling comfortable enough to kind of say we were going to be able to get a good provincial average, early estimate provincial average. And you could see here that when we add that all up, the total mortality was 40%. So essentially 40% of the bees did not survive the winter this year. So that is on a very high side. The last time we heard of losses this high was back in 2013. And just out of winter, we were probably somewhere between 30 and 35% losses. And in the end, when we include all the culls, it went up to about 46%. So we know that this was a fairly bad year. In addition to that, I was able to kind of separate the data out into the various regions and kind of see if I could see any regional trends. Again, as you do that, you're starting to reduce the number of beekeepers representing that whole entire area. So the Southwest had 17 beekeepers, the Central had 17 beekeepers, but some of the other areas had a few, not too many beekeepers responded, and only representing about 5,000. So I say that in saying that these averages I don't feel as confident with, but still I think they're still showing us a trend. And the area in the province that has reported to date, the lowest losses was actually the Northwest region at around 26%. So that's fairly close to the range of normal. So they're just a little higher than normal. and the one with the highest reported losses was the Interlake, but both these areas don't have a lot of beekeepers. The Northwest was one of those areas where I was getting people telling me, I winter outdoors, my bees are under snow, I can't access them. So again, these numbers could change when we do the annual winter loss survey. The one thing I really want to point out is that when you say, when I write percent mortality max min, this is based on individual beekeepers' numbers. And it was just to kind of keep track of what was the highest number and what was kind of the lowest number. And for the entire province, the highest reported losses was 93%. And again, these are commercial beekeepers. They lost 93% of their colonies. And the lowest was at 3%. Again, it was fairly early. This number may not have maintained itself. It might be a lot higher than that. But we did get a lot of variability between extremely high losses and what we would consider pretty low losses. And this is also seen in all of the various regions as well, too. You know, maybe the Interlake is the only one that, you know, really reported fairly high minimal losses as well, too. But a lot of the other areas were below 10%. So there's a lot of variability out there. And just to put this in perspective, this is the kind of the long range winter losses. This is based on that annual winter loss survey. So it includes spring culls. And you can kind of see in a normal year, our range is somewhere between 25 and 15. 15 being the low, 25 being the high, in the range of normal. We have a couple that are outside that range, like, as I mentioned before, 2013 and, you know, 2010 and 2011 were also on that high side. So we were getting fairly high losses, but over the last, you know, 5-6 years, it has kind of fell within that normal range. And when you look at the average right across that period, our long-term average is around 20%. So again, this is kind of representing some of the data you've already seen. So the black bars are the total mortality. So we already know that for the entire province, the total mortality was 40%. But in addition to break it into the various regions, I also, in the question was, how many bees you put into winter? Were they winter indoors or outdoors? So I did get some data on indoor and outdoor wintering, so we can kind of look at those trends. And I will break down the indoor and outdoor further in this presentation. So I'm just going to talk generally about stuff. But you can see here that in most cases, if the black bar is your average, the indoor wintering is your blue bars. And so our blue bars for the entire province came out to a winter loss average of 33%. Our outdoor wintered colonies, which are the yellow bars, their average was 51%. So it's something like an 18% difference. That is definitely a large difference. Usually we often get a 10% difference on the high side. A lot of years, you know, 6 to 8% difference between indoor and outdoor. So it isn't a huge difference between indoor and outdoor, but it's usually outdoor is higher losses. We definitely saw that here too. In most cases, the outdoor winter colonies were higher losses. The exception being the Northwest, and the Eastern is kind of like they were all the same. And I had to double check this data quite a few times to make sure I just didn't calculate it wrong. But no, it ended up being like 33% was indoor, outdoor, either way. So generally outdoor seemed to be higher losses. So when we look more specifically at indoor wintering, and again, kind of this number of representation that kind of gives you confidence in your ability to predict the number, this early estimate of 33% is pretty strong because we had 33,000 colonies represented in the indoor wintering data set. Again, when we break it into the various regions, that colony representation starts to decrease quite quickly. So, you know, our estimates here maybe not as accurate, but I think when you look at trends, if your provincial average is 33, we can see that most regions were kind of in that same kind of ballpark, you know, some 32, 36, 34, 30. So they were all kind of in that low 30s, with the exception of the Interlake, again, being on the much higher side. And just to mention that right here, I think the Interlake was also one of the hardest hit areas based on the drought. When we did our production survey last fall, the Interlake was by far the lowest production area. A lot of other areas were fairly close to normal, and the Interlake was much lower than normal. So, you know, again, it's not that surprising that the winter losses in the Interlake are maybe higher. But again, I'll feel much more confident when I got more data in this representing this region. The other thing before I move on to the next slide, I want to again talk about is that these individual losses in the various regions. And again, as a province, when you just look at the indoor data, we had some very, very high losses indoor, but we also had some very low losses indoor. And we look at all the different regions, and very similarly, again, we had some people reporting very low losses indoor wintering, but we also, again, in most regions, maybe not as dramatic as, you know, the provincial average or the total average, but we had some 90% losses in the central and eastern region and over 50% losses in the other regions. So you are not really that much better off indoor at this point. When we look at the outdoor wintering, again, 20,000 colonies represented here. It wasn't as good as the indoor wintering, and it's kind of understandable. I think outdoor wintering mid-April, a lot of people weren't able to access their colonies to give me those numbers. So we have an overrepresentation in this data set of indoor wintering. So again, this might be this early estimate might be biased towards a lower number because a lot more indoor people were wintering and they seem to have lower losses. When we look at our breakdown in the province, we have more colonies wintered outdoors than we do have indoors. So we'll see if this annual winter loss survey, you know, shows us the same data as this preliminary one, because that one should be represented by a lot of outdoor wintered colonies. Again, just to kind of look at the provincial average, this time we're that 51% is the average loss outdoor. Again, compared to indoor, substantially higher. What I want you to look at is that with that indoor, it was much more consistent between the different regions. They're all kind of in that, you know, 30 to mid 30% percentages. In outdoor wintering, we had some extremes, 87%, 71%. So it seemed like there was a lot more variability outside than indoor. And again, maybe that indoor, you know, outdoor may have been showing the real kind of representation because it is probably going to have a lot more of that dwindle occur right off the bat. And we do see a lot of dwindle when you take indoor colonies and move them outside. So we'll see again if those indoor numbers are sustainable, but a lot of variability outside. And again, similarly, there's a lot of variability between individual beekeepers. We did have some extremely high losses, 99%, essentially 100% loss. And again, we still had some very low losses, and even in some of the regions, but in the regions, these numbers were a lot higher than indoor. In most cases, you know, we have a couple less than 10%, but most of them were above 10% as a minimum. And the maximums were, you know, 80, 90, in one case, 75. So a lot of individual beekeepers lost a lot of colonies this winter. When we asked kind of what would you rank your top 3 reasons for the cause of mortality, the number 1 reason was ineffective varroa control. And I will say this right now, we've been asking the same question for the last, I think, 8 years. And, ineffective Varroa control has never been in the top 5 reasons for causes of mortality. Most people have been fairly confident that they got their mites under control. This year, there was a lot of beekeepers very concerned that their mite levels were out of control and extremely difficult to control this fall. The next top ranked one was weather, which is again understandable. Weather does pop up in most years when we have, a fairly tough winter. The I don't know category was the third top ranked one. Again, that one is kind of a catch-all where if you've ruled out all the other reasons and you don't know what the causes of mortality are, that's the category you're gonna say, is a main reason. But a lot of people don't know what their mites are, don't know whatever, and they just don't know what happened to their bees. So it is a kind of a catch-all category. So not a lot of meaningful you can get out of there. And weed colonies in the fall was number 4, and starvation was number 5. And starvation is usually in that top 3. Weed colonies in the fall is usually in the top 4. One category that wasn't highlighted very much in the responses this time around was poor queens. We didn't blame queens this year. In most years, poor queens is in the top 3 reasons for the losses. Some other areas were feeding, and there was an other category, and some of those others would have actually fed into other reasons as well too. There were people that were commenting about high viruses and all this other stuff, which would have probably been related to high Varroa in some cases. And some people were complaining about canola in their brood chambers, which could contributing to a feeding issue as well too. So maybe this feed one would have gone up. Nosema was ranked right at the very bottom. So again, nobody was blaming Nosema and nobody was blaming poor queens, which was a little bit different than most other years. So in conclusion, I've kept this very short so we could have some more of a discussion. But based on what I've seen in this preliminary data, the losses seem to be high in every region. So, and the losses are not only widespread, there's a high range of variability in every region. So this is not a regional problem, even though I've identified the Interlake as maybe the highest of the high. This is an industry problem. These losses were recorded in every single part of the province. So this is definitely an industry issue this year. The level of mortality in most regions was higher in the outdoor winter colonies than indoor winter colonies. But again, there was a lot of variability there. So we need to kind of figure out what is this variability? How can one beekeeper from, down the street have extremely high losses from another beekeeper that had very low losses? So how do we tease out, the real reasons behind these losses? Or with some of these low estimates, underestimations, we'll have to figure that out. Again, I just reported on the top 5 being Varroa, weather, unknown causes, weed colonies in the fall, and starvation. But in most cases, they're all kind of somewhat interlinked. Weed colonies in the fall doesn't really tell you something. So your Varroa, high Varroa would have contributed to that as well too. So a lot of these things are interlinked, but I think the one common denominator there was that last year, 2021, the whole season was kind of turned on its head. The whole cycle was totally off. And the one reason why Varroa stuck out so much was that it was such a large brood rearing period that year. Even though we had a drought, the brood production in our hives was tremendous. And with lots of brood, if you leave a little bit of mites behind, your mite reproduction is just going to be high. And when it rains finally came in August and the hives brooded up, well into September and even into October, there was kind of constant brood all the way through the fall. So those mites were able to hide away from a lot of our treatments. So we left a lot of mites behind very late in the season. And I think that is a real contributing factor of why the losses are as high as they are. And even if you did control your varroa mite eventually in the fall, they might have been at such high levels for such a long period of time. That's when the viruses will have kind of, you can take out the mites, but the viruses will still keeping that stress on those colonies, you know, well into the winter. And one of the early reports was not only were the losses really high very early in the season, many of those colonies just collapsed probably in November and December, because the amount of feed left behind just proves the fact that there was a population to pack this feed, because the hives are just loaded with feed, but there was no population to consume it. So the bees died very early in the season. So, and again, given the fact that varroa topped the list, I can't, you know, overstate this, that mite management this spring, you need to be on your mites. And even though I kind of say we might have left a lot of mites in the winter, the only way to really know if you have mites to deal with this in the spring is to monitor. You have to monitor your mite levels to kind of know where you're at. A lot of times we have high colony collapse over winter. Not only did the bee population crash, the mite population crashes as well too. So we might be actually having very low levels of mites this year because of the high losses. Anything with high mites just died. But again, the only way we know that is through monitoring. So I'm pleading with you to get into those colonies and get an idea where your mites are and choose an appropriate treatment to kind of get on them. Many beekeepers are still using the Apivar, and it's still recommended, but if we are concerned about Apivar not having the same level of efficacy, it's not working as well as it used to. So if you are doing Apivar, this doesn't stop you from monitoring. So if your Apivar has been in there for, you know, a week or 2 or 3, you know, when the weather's nice, take a sample and find out where your mites are at. And if they're extremely low, you either know your Apivar is working, or maybe you had very low levels of mites before you even started your Apivar treatment. But low mites is a good thing. So again, monitor early and monitor often. And with a conservative estimate of 40%, as I mentioned in 2013, which was a devastating year, that wasn't even 40%. I can safely say that this is probably one of the worst winters we're going to have in, at least in my career, which is 26 plus years. So it's an extremely bad winter. So that question at the beginning, how bad was it? It's pretty bad. And I think the compounding problem that's not part of this survey is that the replacement colonies are probably going to be in very short supply. So this is going to be a tough year, period. But to leave on a positive note, the one positive thing is that despite, you know, these really high losses, as I mentioned, there are some beekeepers reporting fairly low losses. So is there something we can learn from these low loss beekeepers and determine kind of what were some of the major factors, or what do you need to do to prevent your vulnerability of high losses when you come through a drought period or whatever, high mite load? So what do we need to do to try to bring our mite loads down, you know, early enough? Or how do we deal with, you know, pollen fluctuations or whatever related to the drought last year, and try not to repeat this in 10 years, you know? So so hopefully we can work with those people that have low losses and get some responses as to what are some best management practices that we can recommend for people to use to minimize their losses. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I can stop sharing right now, or unless somebody wants to ask a question specifically that I can use my graphs with.
If you can call the slide back up as per question, mainly because the gallery view lets us see where the hands are. So,
Okay.
but we can cope as well. We're not with a massive amount of people online at the moment. One thing I wanted to touch on, Rheal, is that the Mitathon is on right now. The KRTP sent out some notifications, which we helped circulate about pollinator.org every year has, or twice a year, has a mitathon where they ask for beekeepers to check on their mite levels and then report their findings. And how they ask you to check your mite levels is either through the standardized alcohol or sugar wash. Now, we're in a predicament, of course, because every bee counts right now. We do not want to be sacrificing 100 bees for, just for data collection on most of our colonies. It's just been that, there's been that much hardship this spring. However, if things do get nice in the next 5 days, and if you're able to do a sugar roll, reporting that data, the informational links are down in the chat, is really important. Now, there is another mitathon later on in August that if you can't participate in this one, please make the effort to participate in that one. Getting a good sampling from Canada, from the prairie provinces, and specifically from Manitoba really helps researchers. That data really helps research into controlling mites or efficacy of current treatments or resistance levels. So please, if you can, pitch in August if you can't pitch in now. And just to touch on mortality, I know of a couple of beekeepers who had their yards buried, like could not find them. Next year are planning on putting up poles with flags because it's distressing. And of course, when we have a long wet type spring, we had that one period where I know of one yard that was buried, and then we had a pile of slushy mush snow. And you're worried about them getting absolutely cocooned in. And you know what, as much stress as those individuals were under, those bees actually came out really well. Now, I'm not saying go ahead and bury your bees every year, because that's not there's more to it than that. But it is interesting to see how perhaps a little bit of insulation may have been a really good positive thing there. I think with the data that's been collected so far and the data that comes in, it's just pieces of the puzzle. You can extrapolate what you want from this, but in the end, this is a couple of pieces of really good data that will tell a story, but more completely down the road, I think, because there has to be things to, when you get people losing 93% and then some people losing 3%, that's such a, there's something there that needs to really be analyzed, and it'll be fascinating to learn the story behind that quite a broad range of numbers.
Yeah, I will say that in the annual loss survey that we're going to be conducting in May, or we are in May, I guess, when we're going to be conducting in a couple of weeks, it is going to be asking some questions regarding genetics, like your queen stock. And it will be interesting to see whether some of those beekeepers that are reporting the lowest losses in the province, whether they also have been rearing their own stock. So maybe their stock is more in tune to their management than just buying off the shelf stock. We also know that, again, as you manage your bees, and you select if you're kind of managing, the same at the same level year after year, even though there's some fluctuations, your stock is probably reflecting you more than maybe the environment. So you're able to kind of manipulate them. And again, I think that we'll see whether that pans out. But I think what happened with this year is that a lot of stock did not shut down in preparation for winter enough to, really convert into winter bees. And I think we had these beautiful populations you know, in October, maybe when we were wrapping our hives or feeding our bees, and then we kind of, you know, stopped looking at them and kind of got them ready for winter, and all those beautiful bees start dying off because they were summer bees, and there may have not been sufficient winter bees in your hives. So I think some of that is plays into it, but again, whether that could be manipulated through management is the question that we're going to be asking. And if we can see it in the beekeepers that rear their own stock, maybe they have been able to kind of manipulate their bees into say, hey, it's time for winter, boom, and get ready. Because we know that, you know, we most of the bees we buy, we import or whatever, they're a hybrid. They're part Carnica and they're part, you know, Italian. And I think that variation is really well suited for a normal season in Manitoba. But when we have an oddball season, maybe one or the other of those, that hybrid might be better. And I think in this particular case, having more Carniolan kind of lineage may have been better, but again, we'll see if the data shows that.
Now, sort of exasperating some of the problems is the fact of the unavailability of local stock because of a devastating loss here, which of course packaged bees becomes a topic simply because if we can't raise them here, we importing them becomes the next logical choice. Now, I'm not going to touch the US border thing with a 10-foot pole, but the other countries that we traditionally imported bees from, like New Zealand or Chile, those seem to be off the playing field now. And I know some of that was because of being able to get them here. Air Canada is still a little fussy, if not just flat out refusing to ship them. But I guess the question is will there ever be movement in getting more plentiful numbers of stock from other countries other than the US? Because that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, I'll speak to this regarding even this year, but I think there's something going on that's going to be looking at our future as well too. But just for this year, as you mentioned, I think that there has been some changes that have gone on in the transportation of those packages from those countries that we have agreements with, and the numbers that seem to be coming are much less. And some of it simply has to do with what planes they're using. They switched their planes because they're not getting as much traffic. You know, because of COVID, there wasn't as many flights. So they changed their planes, and some of it might be for fuel efficiency. But those planes, they've gone away from some wide body planes to some more narrow body planes, as well as some of the cargo areas of these switched planes don't have the ability to control the climate. So or has a much smaller area where they have controlled climate. So they can only fit one pallet of packages when normally, you know, two pallets of packages would have come. So 50% less packages are coming in one shipment. So those are some of the things that have caused the problems this year. I will say that the importers are still looking to see if they can extend the season and maybe bring in some bees a little bit later than normal. But again, we're working with countries that are kind of going into winter as we go into summer. So there's going to be a line where they're not going to be able to cross. But given the fact that there may still be an interest in getting packages in June or whatever, maybe not necessarily for maximum honey production, but to have something established for next year. So that's still going on right now. The kinks are trying to be worked out, and some of them have to do with permits and a few other things. So hopefully they will pan out. The high price of honey is a challenge as well too. Like, people are holding their bees a little tighter because they know that if they hold these bees, you know, they're gonna kind of guarantee that they're going to be able to have enough bees going into next year when the price is probably still going to be high. So there's a lot of factors in play. But I will say that looking into the future, Canadian Ag Council is kind of developing a kind of a steering committee or a working group that is going to be looking at increasing the supply of bees, and it's looking at imports, but it's also looking at domestics as well too. What do we need to do to kind of increase our current supply of bees, and also kind of look at, you know, how to protect that supply as well too. Like, so our, you know, the supply chain issues, how do we address some supply chain issues that might still pop up? So there's going to be a lot of strategizing this year to try to identify more sources of bees, but also how do we protect those sources of bees so we don't find ourselves having to, you know, find out that half the number of packages or half the number of nukes are going to be coming our way because something happened. So.
Okay. Any questions for Rheal? Please feel free to type them into chat or raise your hand. We do have a couple of somewhat related spring questions in chat. But if there's anything more direct to the winter mortality, we will let Rheal field a few, or on Rheal's presentation, we'll give that the priority.
Rheal, if I may, have you anecdotally noticed any correlation between that late canola bloom and extraordinarily high losses? Because I remember last fall, beekeepers were just losing their minds that the bees were bringing all this canola nectar in September and October. And I can see why. It probably would be a terrible thing. Have you really put together any correlation in there at all?
It's not obvious, because I can tell you right now, there were 4 out of 55 beekeepers that kind of indicated that canola was a significant contributing factor. It made their top 3, but 4 out of 55. So it didn't rank extremely high in the main reasons. Again, that might come out more in the annual loss survey in a couple of weeks. But also, I think now that beekeepers have an opportunity to kind of go through their deadouts, they may be seeing what's actually left behind in those deadouts. And if that feed is rock hard, then they know that canola may have been a contributing factor. But again, I don't have any data on that.
There's a couple of people who are, when you touch base on going through your hives or doing like a hive autopsy, trying to find out what was the cause of mortality. We've gotten a few, one question I want to touch on is, how should the deadouts be dealt with, or what exactly are the key indicators of death, or maybe like everyone's looking for a smoking gun, but that's never as obvious as we wish it could be. One of the things to touch on, though, is that trying to clean out your deadouts sooner than later is highly recommended, mainly because bees are protein, and protein rots, and dead corpses are dead corpses, and you want to get that cleaned out, because the longer you wait, the more of a mess that it generally is. If you're able to examine like where the end cluster was, chances are, because everything starts to get into a pile of mush, that you're not going to say, oh, I found a queen, or or there was no queen present, unless, she was very recently marked in the fall. But one thing I've counseled too is that, especially if you catch your deadouts really early, like February, March, when it's still frozen, you can take frozen corpses, dry them out, try to do a rub and screen and see if you've got a lot of varroa dropping, if you sift them finely enough. But it's one of those things where you're looking for, and if it's starvation, it's going to be pretty evident. Like even if your colony still had resources in plenty, if they got caught in a cold snap and they were broody and they couldn't move a frame or two over, that can still cause it. It generally boils down to winter losses being issues with queen sustainability or mites, or spring dwindling where the bees are aging out and the ambient temperature is really working against you. But if you do have a sense that your dead outs were caused by disease, Rheal, what would you suggest?
Well, it's never really recommended to take a complete dead out and even just clean it out and then take live bees and just throw it on that dead out. A lot of times dilution is the solution. So as a recommendation is you try to dilute your problem. If there was some kind of, presence of a disease, perhaps viruses, perhaps even some nosema, if you take out, 4 or 5 frames of that dead out and you take some super comb and you put it in there, you've diluted, at least 50% of the comb there. And if you put them in the center, that's where you're going to establish a new population on those center frames. They'll still go over to the side to grab some feed, and hopefully that feed is not problematic. But I think doing that, you'll probably be able to minimize any real buildup of disease until that population has a chance to establish. And again, viruses, you can never really eliminate them, but if you allow the bee population to establish and become healthy, those viruses have a much less of an impact, especially if your varroa levels are low and your other stresses in the hive are low. If you do start to see that colony that you added population to dead out equipment start to stagnate, then it would definitely be worthwhile taking a sample of the bees and having them analyzed perhaps for nosema, and then perhaps needing to medicate them with an antibiotic feed, as long as there's enough time to feed them before your honey flow. But in most cases, even with nosema, as their bees become more active outdoors, not stuck in the hives, that nosema level usually starts to subside. With Nosema ceranae, it could rebound. It can go up and down, throughout the beekeeping season, but usually we'll still have some low points. So it allows your bee population to kind of get established. And if it's not stressed and there's ample food, the nutrition is through the roof, they usually can, push off these problems until the population is extremely well established throughout the summer and produce maximum honey production.
There were some concerns with a hypothetical batch of not good feed in the Brandon Carmen area last fall. In your initial survey, did you see that popping up in the comments?
Yeah, there were three reports of frothy syrup. We categorize as frothy syrup. The worst cases, even the syrup did not look normal. It just started bubbling. So we still don't know what's causing that bubbling, whether it's some kind of, reaction, whether it's a chemical reaction or whether it's a biological reaction, is some kind of yeasting buildup. But Dr. Curry and Derek Mickelson are testing some of the syrup for acidity, and they're finding some of these syrups with not only higher levels of acidity. The problem is that they want to stay acidic, and when the bees consume it, they can actually start to neutralize acidic, sugar syrup. But if they can't neutralize it and they keep on consuming acidic syrup, it starts to become toxic. So we know that there are some beekeepers that have had this problem. We're still not quite sure how widespread it is, but in fact, we have a meeting on Thursday to talk more about it. But I would still think it's fairly isolated. It's not everybody got bad syrup last year. It's probably a relatively small number.
Yeah, it was a very localized issue, really, because it wasn't like in commercial operations in one area, even one tanker of syrup doesn't go very far. It's just the quantity used. There was a mention in chat about how to deal with syrup and deadouts that smells fermented. Just to touch on that really quickly, if you have fermented syrup in your hives in the spring, it's an indicator that they did not dry it down or cure it. So you had fed too late. Fermented syrup doesn't necessarily kills bees, but it is definitely a straw on the camel's back, and it can weaken them. It can like give them runny guts, cause a lot of excess. It's just like if you ate something off, your digestive system isn't going to be happy with you either. And unlike bees, you can go whenever time you want to. They have to contain. So if they're eating fermented syrup throughout the winter, that can definitely increase mortality. You have to be careful about when you're feeding. And also, Dr. Curry gave an excellent lecture presentation about healthy syrup and healthy feeding, which is on our YouTube channel. So I suggest please go check that out. Sugar is expensive. God knows everything's expensive. But if you're reusing feed from the fall in the spring, it's really not recommended. If there's something wrong with it, like if you wouldn't drink a liter of it yourself, maybe you shouldn't be feeding it to your livestock. Yes, I know it's all about saving the nickels and dimes, but decisions do impact mortality, and you have to be judicious in your choices. More messages, more questions. There was a question about queens. There is a bit of a plethora of choice: Chilean, Ukrainian, Italian, Saskatraz, Australian. And what queen is best for Manitoba? That's like saying what flavor of ice cream is best for you, because it does also depend on the attributes that you're looking for in a queen, and that can be tailored to how you run your operation as well. There are people that swear by these or those or have their favorites, but each breed does have certain characteristics, and it's good to look up on that. I haven't seen Ukrainian queens in Manitoba before. That'll be interesting to see how they work, but that question was asked by Dominic, and that's a whole evening on its own to be absolutely honest. If anyone wants, they can type their favorite breed in chat, and we can kind of do a straw poll on it. So
I will say that is, as I mentioned in the annual winter loss survey, we added some extra questions about queens, and it really is going to be talking about, do you raise your own queens? If not, where do you buy your queens? Which country? Blah, blah, blah. Is it, or do you buy your queens domestically? Do you buy imported queens? If you buy imported queens, which country? So we might be able to start to, get some data build up on kind of what sources of queens correlate to lowest losses. So hopefully we'll have some of that information. Perhaps, in the future, whoever takes my place as a provincial apiarist will continue to ask that question next year.
As for local queens, that again, it's a very generic, like local. Who's local? Because not all queen breeders put as much attention into genetics Some are pumping out volume. So it's like, you know, is it better to buy a puppy from New Zealand or a puppy from Manitoba? It's not that's a whiskey and cornflakes kind of question. So you really have to, if you're buying local queens, getting to know the person you're buying them from. The beekeeping community in Manitoba isn't that large, where reputations are pretty easily found out. So ask around, and don't be shy to ask people. Like, if you bought queens from so and so or this apiary before, how did they work out for you? And take all the information with a grain of salt. A lot of it is not being lazy and finding out your own information and asking around other people. And that's why networking with fellow beekeepers is so important, because that sharing of information is data, and that data helps you make informed choices. Any other questions that anyone wants to ask, either in just raise your hand, either to Rheal or just to the general population? Just quickly scanning chat. If I've missed anything from chat, we can ask them closer to the end of the meeting as well. So Veronica, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I do. Sorry, I'm kind of COVID-y today, so I don't have much of a voice. Not to be recommended, I have to say. So my question was regarding my colonies, which I had a look at last week, and one of them has subsequently disappeared, but there were no eggs. So they clearly made it through the winter, but have been dwindling. One of the colonies is very strong, and the other one is sort of medium. But I saw 6 eggs over 2 colonies, and both have queens, and but the queens aren't laying. Any comments on that?
And this was recent, or was it?
Just last week. Just
Last week.
yeah, just Saturday or Friday, I forget which.
And is there a pollen supply in the hive?
There is a pollen supply. They've been bringing it in. As soon as it got warm, they started bringing it in. I had also given them some the pollen cakes that have, or the ones from Bee Made that have the Manitoba pollen in them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and they had pollen in. They still had pollen stores.
And are these hives wrapped, or?
They are still wrapped. Yeah.
Okay. Well, to me, they should be brood rearing. So.
Well, I know. But none of them
you might have a queen problem. Are you sure those eggs are actually queen eggs, or are they laying worker eggs?
No, they were queen eggs. I mean, they're in the bottoms of the cells, and well, I mean, I can't say for sure, but they were in the bottoms of the cells. And both of the queens that I saw, well, actually, all 3 of them had queens, but then one of them was very, very small, and it kind of petered out. But yeah, I could see the queen in the very strong colony, which was doing so well. She was going around and she was measuring cells, you know, like she was putting her antennae in, but yeah, there's no brood at all.
Yeah, because usually at this time I would have thought that, you know, a good queen would be laying, and the only reason a good queen wouldn't be laying is that the worker population is just too weak. They're not cleaning cells.
Yeah.
But if you have a decent worker population,
Yeah,
then it goes back to the queen. It could be something else environmental, but if they're wrapped, you're dealing with the environmental side of that. They're not overly cold or anything like that. So
No, they're not cold. No, it's not looking good for me then.
I always use the analogy, I'm maybe too much of a hockey guy, but I always use the analogy that when the team should be doing a lot better, you usually blame the coach. And in this case, the queen is the coach. So I would start to blame the coach.
We published an article of some research and observations in BC. Now, we had a long, hot, scorchingly hot summer, but compared to BC, that we were a cartoon. They were having temperatures of up to like 42, 46 Celsius. But there was some data and research that came in on the cumulative effects of sperm viability in drones. And with the summer that we had, would that heat have affected if a hive requeened itself in later on in the summer? Would the viability, would that have had any impact or contribution to any mortality this winter?
You know, it's possible, you know, if the hive has not been able to thermoregulate properly, then I think there could be some extremes that have occurred that could have these types of impacts. But again, without confidence, I can't say that that's a high, you know, high on the list of reasons why things went wrong.
And not for Manitoba beekeepers to feel better by comparing themselves to dodging some bullets. Like, are there, I've heard of horrific losses in like Ontario. Do you have any preliminary reports on how we fared against other provinces, Ontario or the prairies?
I would say right now we were very comparable to Alberta, but I've now since heard that Ontario and Quebec are not far behind us. Saskatchewan seems to be faring better. Again, the numbers that I heard were kind of around the same time we were hearing numbers. Of our 40, they were like 30, 35. So they were less than us, but they're not good. Mm-hmm. So I think that this, you know, the statement I made here with this not being a regional problem, it being a provincial problem, I think that we could probably almost extrapolate this to being a national problem, because there's a lot of losses right across the country. I heard BC wasn't as bad, but certain parts of BC are not bad and other parts are. So, you know, their average is probably still going to be higher than normal, but maybe not to the same extent as ours. And the Maritimes don't seem to be, you know, as consistently bad, but we also are hearing that there's a lot of concern about the lack of potential for pollination, because the losses are there. And the blueberry industry has been on this expansion, and they're basically saying we need more bees, and the maritime beekeepers can't provide them. So we need to look at other provinces, and they hear Quebec has not got a good winter. Ontario has not got a good winter. Manitoba has not got a good winter. So they're getting worried as well.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially for like blueberry pollination.
Yeah.
That's harsh.
Which is it's near. It's very close.
Any other winter mortality questions? This won't be the end of our question period. It just to sort of boundary in the topic. Dominique had a question about how high should your hive be from the ground. Not very. You don't want another side to insulate. A lot of beekeepers, if they're wintering outdoors, will have their hives on pallets and wrap the pallets. And again, insulation on the bottom board as well. Don't forget that last side of the cube, that's for sure. If there are no other questions for Rheal, we're going to move on to the other parts of the meeting. I want to thank you very much, Rheal, for taking the time out of your busy day to come and speak with us. It was very eye-opening. And thank you for the job you do as provincial apiarist, for collecting the data, for being the target of probably a lot of angst sometimes as well for policies beyond your control. You've always done so great at representing us and assisting our organizations. We really do appreciate it.